Colorado Territory, 1885. Golden sunlight bathed the rugged mountains surrounding Silverdale, a mining town that had seen better days since the silver rush petered out. Vast swaths of pine-covered hills stretched as far as the eye could see, and among them, Victor Ainsworth's cattle ranch stood as a testament to a different kind of prosperity. At 26, Victor had amassed more wealth than most men twice his age. His clean-shaven face, square jaw, and striking blue eyes turned heads whenever he rode into town. Standing 6 feet tall with broad shoulders shaped by years of hard ranch work, he cut an impressive figure whether on horseback or striding through Silverdale's dusty streets. Unlike other wealthy ranchers who flaunted their fortune with gaudy attire, Victor dressed simply in well-made clothes, a quality that only added to his appeal. Yet for all his success, Victor believed one thing with absolute certainty: money was everything in the West. He had watched his parents struggle and ultimately perish on their failing homestead when he was just 14. Starvation and illness had taken them within months of each other, teaching him the harshest lesson the frontier could offer. Wealth meant survival, and survival was all that mattered. A man cannot eat sentiment, he often told his ranch foreman, Samuel Johnston, and you cannot build a life on empty pockets and wishful thinking. Victor's ranch sprawled across 5,000 acres of prime, grazing land. His cattle numbered in the thousands, his horses were the finest in 3 territories, and his bank accounts grew fatter with each passing season. He had everything a man could want, except someone to share it with. Not that he believed he needed anyone. Companionship was a luxury he had convinced himself was unnecessary, perhaps even dangerous. The few courtships he had attempted left him cold and unfulfilled. "Those ladies want my money, not me," he confided to Samuel one evening as they sat on the ranch house porch. "They see the ranch, the cattle, the accounts. They do not see Victor Ainsworth." Samuel, a weathered man in his 50s who had been with Victor since the beginning, merely shrugged. "Maybe you ain't looking at the right ladies." That night, as Victor lay alone in his large, comfortable bed inside a house that echoed with emptiness, he felt the familiar hollow ache that all his wealth couldn't seem to fill. He pushed it away as he always did, focusing instead on the next day's business. The Silverdale Bank needed his investment to stay afloat, and he had already decided to provide it. Not out of charity. Victor didn't believe in such foolishness, but because a functioning bank served his interests. The next morning dawned clear and crisp as Victor rode toward town. The September air carried the first hint of autumn, and the aspens had begun turning gold against the evergreen backdrop. He arrived at the bank just as it opened, tethering his stallion outside before stepping through the double doors. Inside, a heated exchange caught his attention. The bank manager, Henry Wilson, stood behind his desk, his face flushed with embarrassment as he addressed a young woman dressed in modest black. "I am truly sorry, Mrs. Sutton, but the bank cannot extend any further credit. Your husband's debts have already exceeded the value of the property." The woman stood straight-backed, her chin raised despite the obvious distress in her eyes. "Mr. Wilson, I am not asking for charity. I merely need time to make the property profitable again." "That may be so," Wilson replied, not unkindly. "But the bank's shareholders require security that simply isn't there." Victor found himself studying the widow with unexpected interest. Violet Sutton couldn't have been more than 22 or 23 years old. Her honey-blonde hair was pinned neatly beneath a simple black bonnet, and her black morning dress, though well-made, showed signs of wear. Despite her circumstances, there was an unmistakable dignity in her bearing that Victor found himself admiring. "Perhaps," Victor said, stepping forward, "the bank's newest investor might have some input on this matter." Both Wilson and Mrs. Sutton turned toward him, startled by the interruption. "Mr. Ainsworth," Wilson stammered, "I wasn't expecting you until later." "Clearly," Victor replied dryly. He turned his attention to the widow. "Mrs. Sutton, I believe. I am Victor Ainsworth." "Violet Sutton," she replied, her voice steady despite the flush that had risen to her cheeks. "And I do not require intervention, Mr. Ainsworth. This is a private matter between myself and the bank." Victor was taken aback by her directness. Most people in Silverdale tended to defer to him automatically, especially when they needed financial assistance. Her clear green eyes met his without wavering, and he found himself intrigued rather than offended. Privacy is a luxury few can afford in a town this size, Mrs. Sutton, he replied. May I ask what property we're discussing? Wilson answered before she could. The old Miller place, about 5 miles east of town. Mrs. Sutton's late husband purchased it last year, but he passed before he could make it profitable. The drought took our crops, Violet added stiffly. And then influenza took my husband 3 months ago. But the land is good, and with proper management, the Miller place. Victor interrupted, his interest genuinely piqued. That borders my east pasture. This changed things considerably. Victor had been looking to expand his holdings in that direction for years, but old Miller had refused to sell. If the bank foreclosed, the land would go to auction, and Victor would face competition from other ranchers. Mrs. Sutton, he said, making a swift decision. Perhaps we could discuss this further. I might have a proposition that would benefit us both. Her eyes narrowed slightly. I'm not selling, Mr. Ainsworth, if that's what you're proposing. Not at all, he replied, though that had indeed been his first thought. But perhaps we could continue this conversation somewhere more comfortable than the bank lobby. After a moment's hesitation, Violet nodded. Very well. Though I warn you, Mr. Ainsworth, I did not come to Silverdale to be anyone's charity case. The Silver Spoon Cafe across from the bank was nearly empty at that hour. Victor selected a table near the window and pulled out a chair for Mrs. Sutton. Once they were seated with coffee before them, he studied her more carefully. Up close, he could see the exhaustion etched around her eyes and the way her hands, though delicate, were reddened from work. Yet there was a stubborn strength in her bearing that he couldn't help but respect. She was undeniably beautiful, with fine features and clear skin that glowed despite her obvious fatigue. I understand you're in a difficult position, Victor began. You understand nothing of my position, Mr. Ainsworth, she replied quietly. But I appreciate your intent. Victor found himself unexpectedly wrong-footed by her candor. Then perhaps you might enlighten me. Violet took a sip of her coffee before responding. My husband, Edward, was a dreamer. He brought me west from Boston with promises of prosperity and adventure. Instead, I found myself married to a man who knew little about farming and even less about fiscal responsibility. Yet you stayed, Victor observed. I made vows, she said simply, for better or worse. And there was worse aplenty. And now I find myself with a farm I can barely maintain, debts I cannot pay, and a town full of people who believe I should either remarry immediately or return east to my family. Her green eyes flashed with determination. I intend to do neither. Victor considered her situation. The practical choice would be to wait for the bank to foreclose and then buy the property at auction. Yet something about Violet Sutton's quiet dignity made him consider alternatives he would normally dismiss. What if, he said slowly, I were to clear your debts with the bank in exchange for a partnership? The Miller place has good water rights that would benefit my cattle operation, and you clearly need capital to make the farm viable. Violet's eyes widened slightly. A partnership? Between us? That would hardly be proper, Mr. Ainsworth. I'm a widow of 3 months, not a business associate. Victor hadn't considered the propriety angle. In the world of cattle and commerce he inhabited, such concerns rarely arose. But she was right. A business arrangement between a single man and a young widow would set tongues wagging across 3 counties. Before he could respond, the cafe door swung open and 3 women entered, all dressed in the respectable attire of Silverdale's social elite. Their conversation halted abruptly when they spotted Violet sitting with Victor. Mrs. Sutton, one of them said with exaggerated surprise, How unexpected to see you in town today. Mrs. Palmer, Violet acknowledged with a slight nod. Mrs. Davis, Mrs. Green. The women's eyes darted between Violet and Victor, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. Mr. Ainsworth, Mrs. Palmer continued, how generous of you to entertain our newest widow. So many men would not bother with charity cases. Victor felt a flash of irritation at the woman's transparent attempt to embarrass Violet. Mrs. Sutton and I are discussing business matters that benefit us both, ladies. Hardly charity. Mrs. Palmer's eyebrows rose. Business? How progressive. After the women had seated themselves at a distant table, still whispering among themselves, Victor turned back to Violet. Her cheeks were flushed, but her expression remained composed. Now you see my dilemma, she said quietly. 3 months a widow, and already my reputation hangs by a thread. A business partnership with a bachelor, even one as respectable as yourself, would sever it completely. Victor had never given much thought to the social constraints women faced on the frontier. His wealth had always insulated him from the worst of small-town gossip. But watching Violet Sutton's dignified response to the women's obvious disdain, he felt a strange urge to protect her from such petty cruelties. "What if," he said, the idea forming even as he spoke, "there was a way to resolve both problems at once?" Violet looked at him questioningly. "Marriage," Victor said, surprising himself with the suggestion. "A practical arrangement. You would have your debts cleared and your property secured. I would gain the water rights I need for my eastern expansion. The society ladies would have nothing to gossip about." He expected shock, perhaps even outrage at such a mercenary proposal. Instead, Violet regarded him thoughtfully. "You speak of marriage as one might discuss purchasing cattle, Mr. Ainsworth." "I speak practically," he countered. "Is that not what the frontier demands? Practical solutions to difficult problems. And what of love, Mr. Ainsworth? Does that have no place in your practical world?" Victor's expression hardened slightly. "Love is a luxury, Mrs. Sutton, like fine china or silk draperies. Pleasant to have, perhaps, but hardly essential for survival." Something flickered in her eyes. Disappointment, perhaps? Before she composed her features once more. "You make a compelling business case," she said finally. "But I would need certain assurances." "Name them." "The farm remains in my name, regardless of our arrangement. I continue to work it as I see fit. And this is a partnership in truth, not merely a convenient fiction to silence gossip." Victor considered her terms. They were reasonable, even generous considering her desperate circumstances. "Agreed. And I would add one condition of my own. Yes, we present this as a genuine marriage to the world. No hints of convenience or arrangement. My reputation as a businessman depends on perception as much as reality." Violet hesitated only briefly before extending her hand. "Then it seems we have an agreement, Mr. Ainsworth." Victor took her hand, noting how small it seemed in his own despite the calluses that spoke of hard work. "Victor," he corrected, "if we're to be married, you should use my given name." "Victor," she repeated, and for a moment, something passed between them that had nothing to do with property rights or bank loans. The wedding took place the following Sunday after church services, with the entire town in attendance, some to offer genuine well wishes, others to satisfy their curiosity about the hasty union between Silverdale's wealthiest bachelor and its newest widow. Violet wore a simple dress of pale blue, her mourning period technically incomplete, but the circumstances demanding some concession to the occasion. Victor found himself unexpectedly moved as he watched her walk down the aisle toward him, her head held high despite the whispers that followed her. The vows were traditional, though neither bride nor groom added personal embellishments. When the minister pronounced them man and wife, Victor placed a chaste kiss on Violet's lips, brief but proper. Something stirred within him at the contact, something he promptly dismissed as the natural response of a man who had been too long without female companionship. The wedding celebration at the Silverdale Hotel was lavish by local standards, paid for entirely by Victor. If the town was determined to talk, he had decided, let them talk about his generosity rather than the unusual circumstances of the marriage. As evening fell and the guests began departing, Victor found himself growing increasingly aware of what lay ahead. The marriage required consummation to be legal, a fact both parties had acknowledged with businesslike detachment during their negotiations. Now, as the practical reality approached, Victor felt an unfamiliar nervousness take hold. The bridal suite at the hotel was the finest room available, decorated with fresh flowers and lit by the warm glow of oil lamps. When Victor and Violet finally retired there, an awkward silence fell between them. "Would you prefer that Victor began. "Perhaps we should," Violet said simultaneously. They both stopped, and to Victor's surprise, Violet smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her solemn features and sparked something unexpected in his chest. "This need not be uncomfortable," she said softly. "We are adults who have made a practical arrangement." "Yes," Victor agreed, though he suddenly found himself wishing for something less practical and more, something he couldn't quite name. In the soft lamplight, with her honey-blonde hair falling loose around her shoulders, Violet looked younger and more vulnerable than she had appeared during their negotiations. Victor found himself wanting to know more about the woman he had just married. "Tell me about Boston," he said, removing his jacket and hanging it carefully over a chair. "What brought you west in the first place?" Violet's expression softened as she sat at the dressing table, beginning to remove the pins from her hair. "My parents died when I was 16. I went to live with my aunt, who was determined to see me suitably married to a Boston gentleman of appropriate standing. And yet you chose a farmer with Western ambitions." "Edward was charming and full of dreams," she said, a hint of sadness in her voice. "And I was young enough to believe that dreams were sufficient currency in this world." "You no longer believe in dreams?" Victor asked, removing his boots. Violet met his eyes in the mirror. "I believe in what I can build with my own two hands. Dreams are like morning mist, beautiful but insubstantial." Victor found himself nodding in agreement, yet also feeling a strange disappointment that this young woman had already lost something that he himself had discarded years ago. "And you?" she asked, turning to face him. "What shaped the practical businessman who proposes marriage as a solution to water rights issues?" Despite himself, Victor smiled at her characterization. "Starvation has a way of prioritizing one's thinking," he said simply. "My parents died poor. I determined never to follow their path." Violet's expression softened. "I'm sorry about your parents. It's not easy being orphaned, no matter the age." The genuine compassion in her voice caught him off guard. People rarely expressed sympathy to Victor Ainsworth these days. His success had transformed him from object of pity to object of envy years ago. "It was a long time ago," he said, more gruffly than he intended. An awkward silence fell between them again as the inevitable moment approached. Victor had known many women before, but never a wife, and never in circumstances so oddly formal yet intimate. "We need not." Violet began hesitantly. "That is, if you would prefer to wait until we know each other better." Victor was tempted to accept the implied postponement, but practicality reasserted itself. "The marriage must be legal in all respects," he said. "Otherwise, our arrangement serves no purpose." Something flickered in Violet's eyes. Disappointment again? But she nodded in agreement. "Of course, you're right." Later, as moonlight filtered through the lace curtains, Victor lay awake beside his sleeping wife. The consummation had been gentle, respectful, but devoid of the passion he had experienced with other women. Yet there had been something in Violet's quiet dignity, in the trust she had placed in him despite their practical arrangement, that left him feeling strangely moved. He had married for water rights and to expand his ranch. She had married to save her farm and preserve her independence. It was a business transaction, nothing more. Yet as Victor finally drifted toward sleep, a small, unwelcome thought crept into his mind. Perhaps, just perhaps, he had acquired something in this marriage that wasn't listed in their carefully negotiated terms. The following morning, Victor drove Violet to her farm in his wagon before they would continue to his ranch. The Miller place, Sutton Farm now, looked worse than Victor had imagined. The small house needed repairs, the barn roof sagged dangerously, and the fields lay fallow after the failed crops of the previous season. "It's not much," Violet said, noticing his expression as they pulled up to the house. "But it has potential." Victor refrained from voicing his doubt. Instead, he helped her inside to gather her belongings for the move to his ranch. The interior of the house was sparse but meticulously clean. A few pieces of simple furniture, some books, and a collection of dried wildflowers in a blue vase were the only decorative touches. "You need not take everything," Victor said. "My home is fully furnished." "Your home," Violet corrected gently. "Not yet ours. And there are some things I would prefer to have with me." She ran her hand over a patchwork quilt folded at the foot of her narrow bed. "My mother made this." For the first time, Victor considered how difficult this transition might be for her, leaving her independence behind, however limited it had been, to become the wife of a man she barely knew. "Take whatever will make you comfortable," he said, surprising himself with the sentiment. "My house has room enough." By mid-afternoon, they had arrived at the Ainsworth ranch. Violet's eyes widened as they crested the final hill and the property came into view. The main house was 2 stories of solid construction, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. Several outbuildings, all well-maintained, clustered nearby, and beyond them stretched fenced pastures where cattle grazed contentedly. "You didn't mention the size of your operation," Violet said quietly. Victor glanced at her, suddenly concerned that she might think he had misled her. Does it make a difference? She considered for a moment, then shook her head. No. A partnership is a partnership, regardless of scale. But her hands twisted nervously in her lap as the wagon rolled toward the house. Samuel and the ranch hands had gathered to welcome the new Mrs. Ainsworth, their curiosity barely concealed behind respectful greetings. The housekeeper, Mrs. Larson, a stern woman in her 60s who had managed Victor's household for years, watched from the porch with an expression that suggested she was reserving judgment. "Welcome home, Mrs. Ainsworth," Samuel said, helping Violet down from the wagon with surprising gentleness. "We're mighty pleased to have a lady in the house at last." "Thank you, Mr. Johnston, ma'am." "Samuel Johnston. I'm the foreman here." Victor watched as Violet greeted each of the hands by name, taking a moment to acknowledge each man individually. It was well done, he thought with approval. The first impression a ranch wife made with the hands often set the tone for years to come. Mrs. Larson proved a harder audience. Her greeting was correct, but cool as she showed Violet through the house. Victor, following behind, saw his home through new eyes, the sparse decoration, the functional but uninviting rooms, the sense that it was a place where business was conducted rather than a life lived. "And this is the master bedroom," Mrs. Larson announced, opening the door to Victor's private domain. The large room contained a massive four-poster bed, a wardrobe, and little else. No pictures adorned the walls, no personal items cluttered the surfaces. "Thank you, Mrs. Larson," Violet said politely. "I'm sure I'll find everything very comfortable." When the housekeeper had departed, closing the door behind her with a final assessing glance, Violet turned to Victor with a raised eyebrow. "She doesn't approve of me," she stated simply. "Mrs. Larson doesn't approve of change," Victor corrected. "She'll adjust." "As will I," Violet said, moving to the window to look out at the ranch spread below. "This is quite different from what I'm accustomed to." Victor joined her at the window, suddenly aware of how close they stood. "Better, I hope." Violet turned to face him, her expression serious. "Different isn't always better or worse, Victor. Just different." She gestured toward the room. "May I make some changes? To make it feel more like our room, rather than yours that I'm occupying?" The request was reasonable, yet Victor felt a flash of resistance. His home, like his business, had been arranged precisely as he preferred. The idea of rearrangement, of feminine touches altering spaces he had carefully controlled, provoked an unexpected anxiety. "Of course," he said finally, reminding himself that this was part of their arrangement. Within reason. A slight smile curved Violet's lips. "I assure you, my taste runs to the practical. I won't transform your ranch house into a Boston parlor." That night, after a somewhat stilted dinner during which Mrs. Larson had watched Violet's every move with hawkish intensity, they retired to the bedroom together for the second time. The awkwardness of the previous night returned, though in different form. "I usually read before sleeping," Victor said, gesturing toward the book on his nightstand. "As do I," Violet replied, pulling a worn volume from her small trunk of possessions. They undressed with a pretense of privacy, each turning away from the other as they changed into nightclothes. When they finally lay side by side in the large bed, a careful distance maintained between them, Victor found himself strangely dissatisfied with the arrangement. "We need not maintain such formality," he said after several minutes of silence. "We are married, after all." Violet turned her head to look at him, her honey blonde hair spread across the pillow. "What did you have in mind?" The question was innocent enough, but something in her tone made Victor's heart beat a little faster. "Conversation, perhaps. We know so little of each other." "Very well," she agreed, setting her book aside. "What would you like to know about me, Victor Ainsworth?" Over the next hour, they exchanged the basic outlines of their lives. Victor learned that Violet had been educated at a girls' school in Boston, that she played the piano, and that she had a surprising knowledge of agriculture gleaned from books and her brief experience as a farmer's wife. He told her about building his ranch from nothing, about his plans for expansion, and a little, very little, about his childhood before his parents' deaths. What Victor didn't say was how the moonlight filtering through the window made Violet's skin glow like pearl, or how the sound of her laugh when he told her about his first disastrous cattle drive sent a warmth through him that had nothing to do with the comfortable room. "It's late," he said finally, aware that they must rise early for ranch work. We should sleep. Violet nodded, extinguishing her lamp. As darkness filled the room, Victor felt her shift beside him, settling into the mattress. Good night, Victor, she murmured. Good night, Violet, he replied, and found himself wishing, irrationally, that there was more between them than a business arrangement. The following weeks established a rhythm to their shared life. Victor rose at dawn to work with the hands, returning for the midday meal that Violet now supervised in Mrs. Larson's domain. Afternoons saw him attending to ranch business or riding to town, while Violet gradually made subtle changes to the house. Flowers appearing on tables, curtains softening windows, areas of comfort emerging in previously utilitarian spaces. Each evening, they dined together and talked, learning more about each other's pasts and present thoughts. Each night, they shared the bed, sometimes merely sleeping side by side, sometimes joining in the physical consummation of their marriage. These encounters remained cordial, even pleasant, but lacked the emotional connection that Victor found himself increasingly curious about. October brought cattle sales and a trip to Denver, where Victor introduced Violet as his wife to his business associates. She played her part perfectly, charming the men with her intelligence and their wives with her genuine interest in their lives. More than once, Victor caught himself watching her with a pride that had nothing to do with appearances and everything to do with the capable woman she was proving herself to be. You could have pursued any bachelor in 3 territories, one of the banker's wives told Victor during a dinner party. Yet you chose a widow with no fortune and no connections. Some might call that peculiar. Victor's gaze found Violet across the room, deep in conversation with a cattle buyer whose attention she had diverted from another rancher's wife. The lamplight caught the gold in her hair and the animation in her expression as she spoke. I recognize value when I see it, Mrs. Hammond, Victor replied. That's what makes me a good businessman. The woman's eyebrows rose. Is that what your marriage is? A business transaction? The question struck uncomfortably close to the truth, yet Victor found himself shaking his head. My marriage is the best decision I've made in years, he said, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. Later that night, in their hotel room, Violet removed the pearl combs from her hair while Victor watched her reflection in the mirror. You were magnificent tonight, he said. Harrison was ready to sell his entire herd at half price just to please you. Violet smiled, meeting his eyes in the glass. I merely asked questions about his children. Men do love to talk about their accomplishments. Is that what you think? That men are so simple. She turned to face him directly. Not all men. Some are quite complex. Something in her tone made Victor's pulse quicken. And which category do I fall into, wife? Violet rose from her seat and moved toward him, stopping just short of touching. You, Victor Ainsworth, are a puzzle I have not yet solved. Perhaps I am an open book, he suggested, aware of her closeness, of the scent of lavender that always surrounded her. If so, it's written in a language I'm still learning. Her hand lifted, hesitating briefly before coming to rest against his cheek. It was a gesture of intimacy they had not shared before, outside their physical encounters, and it sent a jolt through Victor that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with something deeper, more frightening. He caught her hand, intending to remove it, to restore the careful distance they maintained. Instead, he found himself turning his face to press his lips against her palm. Violet's breath caught, and in her eyes, Victor saw a vulnerability that mirrored his own unexpected feelings. For a moment, their arrangement seemed to waver, transforming into something neither had planned for. Then a knock at the door broke the spell, a bellboy delivering a telegram that required Victor's immediate attention. By the time the business was concluded, the moment had passed, and they resumed their roles as practical partners in a practical marriage. November brought the first snow and a letter from the bank confirming that Violet's farm was now free of debt, the final payment having been made from Victor's accounts. She read the letter at breakfast, her expression unreadable. Thank you, she said simply, folding the paper carefully. You fulfilled your part of our arrangement completely. It was as agreed, Victor replied, suddenly uncomfortable with the transactional tone. In the weeks since their wedding, he had thought less and less about the practical reasons for their union and more about the woman herself. Yes, Violet said, rising from the table. Exactly as agreed. Over the following days, Victor noticed a subtle withdrawal in Violet's manner. She remained the perfect ranch wife in all observable ways, managing the household efficiently, presenting a united front with Victor to the hands and the townsfolk, sharing his bed when appropriate. But something had changed, some warmth had diminished, as though she had remembered the boundaries of their arrangement just as Victor had begun to forget them. December arrived with bitter cold and preparations for Christmas. Victor, who had never bothered much with the holiday, found himself oddly enthusiastic about Violet's plans for decorating the ranch house and preparing a feast for the Hands and their families. "You needn't go to such trouble," he told her as she supervised the hanging of evergreen boughs along the staircase. The men would be happy with an extra day's pay and a bottle of whiskey. Violet paused in her work, a sprig of holly in her hand. "Christmas isn't about what's necessary, Victor. It's about creating joy in the midst of winter's darkness." She studied him curiously. "Didn't your family celebrate when you were a child?" Victor's expression closed. "We had little to celebrate most years." Violet's eyes softened with compassion. "Then perhaps it's time you learned what Christmas can be when there's plenty to share." The week before Christmas, a blizzard swept through the territory, dropping 3 feet of snow and sending temperatures plummeting. Victor and the Hands worked tirelessly to ensure the cattle were protected, moving them to sheltered areas and providing extra feed. On the 3rd day of the storm, Samuel rode in with news that chilled Victor more thoroughly than the biting wind. "The Mitchell family's in trouble," the foreman reported, snow crusting his beard. "Their cabin roof collapsed under the weight of the snow. They've moved to their root cellar, but it's no place for those little ones in this weather." The Mitchells were tenant farmers who worked a small plot at the edge of Victor's property. He knew them only slightly, a couple with 4 young children who kept to themselves and paid their rent on time. "How bad is it?" Victor asked, already calculating the risks of a rescue attempt in such conditions. "Bad enough," Samuel replied grimly. "The missus is expecting again, and soon from the look of her when I stopped there last week. That cellar's damp and cold, no place for a woman in her condition." Victor nodded. "Decision made. Prepare the large sled and extra horses. We'll bring them back here until their cabin can be repaired. The pass between here and their place is likely drifted over," Samuel warned. "It'll be dangerous going. Then we'd best start now, before it gets worse." Victor went to inform Violet of the situation, finding her in the kitchen preparing bread dough. "I'll come with you," she said immediately upon hearing his plan, already reaching for her heavy coat. "Absolutely not," Victor replied, surprised by the suggestion. "It's far too dangerous." Violet's expression hardened with determination. "If Mrs. Mitchell is near her time, she'll need another woman. Besides, I grew up with Boston winters. I know how to handle snow." "This isn't Boston," Victor argued. "This is frontier weather that kills people every year. I won't risk you as well." "I'm not asking permission, Victor," Violet said quietly. "If you're going, I'm going. Mrs. Mitchell will need me." They stared at each other, locked in the first real conflict of their marriage. Victor saw the steel beneath Violet's usually accommodating exterior and realized with a mixture of frustration and admiration that she would not be swayed. "You'll follow my instructions exactly," he said finally. "And at the first sign of trouble, you'll turn back with one of the Hands as escort." Violet nodded, already gathering supplies. "We'll need blankets, hot bricks wrapped in flannel, broth in sealed containers to stay warm." Her practical efficiency both impressed and worried Victor. She was proving herself far more capable than most frontier wives, yet the thought of exposing her to such danger made his stomach clench with an anxiety he hadn't expected to feel. The journey to the Mitchell farm was every bit as treacherous as Samuel had predicted. Snow drifts taller than a man blocked portions of the trail, requiring detours through woods where tree branches groaned beneath their icy burden. The temperature continued to drop as afternoon waned toward evening, and the wind cut through layers of clothing like a knife. Throughout it all, Violet remained steady, her face partially protected by the scarf wrapped around her head, her gloved hands gripping the sled railing as they navigated the difficult terrain. Not once did she complain or suggest turning back, though Victor knew she must be feeling the cold as severely as the rest of them. They reached the Mitchell farm as darkness was falling, the collapsed cabin clearly visible as a mound of timber half buried in snow. Samuel located the root cellar entrance and cleared away the drifts that had nearly sealed it shut. The scene inside was grim. James Mitchell, a thin man with a perpetual stoop, had done his best to make the earthen space habitable. Blankets hung from the low ceiling to create some protection from the drafts, and a small fire burned in an improvised hearth, the smoke finding its way out through a hastily constructed chimney. But the air was damp and cold, and the 4 children, ranging in age from 2 to 10, huddled together on a pallet of straw, their faces pinched with cold and fear. Martha Mitchell sat among them, her pregnant belly enormous beneath the layers of blankets wrapped around her. Her face was gray with exhaustion, but she managed a wan smile as the rescue party entered. "We didn't expect anyone to come," she said weakly. "Not in this weather." Violet was at her side instantly, removing her gloves to place a hand against the woman's forehead. "You're feverish," she murmured, then turned to Victor with a look that conveyed the seriousness of the situation. "We need to move quickly," Victor told Mitchell. "Pack whatever essentials you need. We're taking all of you back to the ranch." While the men organized the evacuation, Violet attended to Martha, speaking softly and helping her prepare for the journey. Victor, overseeing the loading of the sled, found his attention repeatedly drawn to his wife's capable movements and gentle authority. Something swelled in his chest that felt dangerously like pride, not in his possession of her, but in her essential self. The return journey began in near darkness, the way lit only by lanterns that cast eerie pools of light on the snow-covered landscape. The Mitchell children, wrapped in every available blanket, huddled in the center of the sled with their mother. Violet sat beside Martha, holding her hand and periodically checking her condition. They had covered perhaps half the distance to the ranch when Martha let out a low moan that made Violet's head snap up in alarm. "Victor," she called over the wind. "We need to stop. The baby's coming." Victor felt a spike of fear. They were miles from the ranch, in the midst of a blizzard that showed no signs of abating. "Can she hold on? We're still an hour from home in these conditions." Violet shook her head, her expression grave. "No, this baby isn't waiting." There was no choice but to seek immediate shelter. A rocky outcropping 100 yards off the trail offered some protection from the wind, and the men worked frantically to create a more substantial windbreak with the tarpaulins they had brought. Inside this makeshift shelter, Violet prepared to deliver Martha's baby, while Victor and the hands kept the children warm and the fire burning. "I need clean cloth, hot water if possible, and privacy," Violet instructed, her voice calm despite the desperate circumstances. Victor organized the men to meet her requirements, then positioned himself at the entrance to the shelter, both to stand guard and to give the women the privacy they needed. From his post, he could hear Violet's steady voice encouraging Martha through the labor, her tone never betraying the danger they all faced if the storm worsened or if complications arose with the birth. Hours passed, marked by Martha's increasingly frequent cries and the howling of the wind outside their fragile shelter. The children had finally succumbed to exhaustion and slept huddled together under the watchful eye of their father. Samuel and the other hands rotated duties, keeping the fire fed and the perimeter secure against the encroaching snow. Just after midnight, when it seemed the storm might finally be lessening, a new cry joined the night, the thin wail of a newborn taking its first breath. Victor turned toward the sound, relief washing through him so powerfully that his knees nearly buckled. Moments later, Violet's voice called out, "Victor, you can come now." He entered the sectioned-off area of the shelter to find Martha propped up on blankets, exhausted but smiling, a small bundle cradled in her arms. Violet knelt beside her, her face streaked with sweat despite the cold, her sleeves rolled up and her hands red from being washed with snow. "A healthy boy," Violet announced, a tired smile lighting her face. "Mother and child are doing well, considering the circumstances." Victor looked from the baby to Violet, suddenly seeing her as if for the first time. In that moment, she was not the practical partner he had married for convenience, but something infinitely more precious, a woman of extraordinary courage and compassion who had just helped bring new life into the world under the most challenging conditions imaginable. "You're remarkable," he said softly, the words escaping before he could consider them. Violet's eyes widened slightly at the unexpected praise, a flush that had nothing to do with exertion coloring her cheeks. "I only did what was necessary." "No," Victor contradicted gently. "You did what was right, regardless of the risk to yourself." There's a difference. Something shifted between them in that small, improbable shelter as a blizzard raged and a newborn slept. Something fundamental that neither had anticipated when they made their practical arrangement. By dawn, the storm had subsided enough to allow them to continue their journey. Martha and her baby were wrapped in the warmest blankets and secured in the center of the sled with the other children. The Mitchell family reached the Ainsworth Ranch by mid-morning, where Mrs. Larson had prepared rooms and hot food in anticipation of their arrival. Victor, after ensuring the horses were properly tended, entered the house to find it transformed by purposeful activity. The Mitchell children had been bathed and fed. James was helping Samuel assess what would be needed to rebuild their cabin, and Martha and her new son were installed in the guest bedroom under Mrs. Larson's surprisingly gentle care. Violet was nowhere to be seen. "She's gone to rest, poor thing," Mrs. Larson informed Victor when he inquired. "Never seen a lady work so hard or care so little for her own comfort. She didn't even stop to change her clothes until she was sure everyone else was settled." The housekeeper's tone had changed noticeably, the previous coolness replaced by genuine respect. It seemed Violet had won over even her most skeptical critic. Victor found his wife asleep in their bedroom, still partially dressed as though she had intended only to rest briefly before returning to her duties. Her honey blonde hair had come loose from its pins and spread across the pillow, and even in sleep, a small line of concentration remained between her brows. Watching her, Victor confronted a truth he had been avoiding for weeks. He had married Violet for water rights and property expansion, but he was falling in love with her for reasons that had nothing to do with practical considerations. The realization terrified him. Love was unpredictable, unquantifiable, the opposite of the carefully controlled life he had built. Love had not saved his parents from starvation. Love could not be deposited in a bank or used to purchase cattle. Love was, as he had told Violet, a luxury, and luxuries were dangerous because they made one vulnerable. Yet as he gazed at his sleeping wife, Victor acknowledged that it might be too late for such rational arguments. The feeling had taken root without his permission and was growing despite his attempts to frame their relationship in purely practical terms. The question that remained was whether Violet could ever see him as more than a convenient solution to her problems. She fulfilled her part of their bargain with grace and competence, but could she, feel anything deeper for the man who had essentially purchased her freedom? The Mitchell family remained at the Ainsworth Ranch through Christmas, their presence turning the holiday into a true celebration despite the circumstances that had brought them there. Violet threw herself into creating the Christmas she had described to Victor, the house decorated with evergreens and candles, special foods prepared, gifts arranged for everyone, including the Hands and their families who joined them for Christmas dinner. Victor, watching her move among their guests with natural warmth and hospitality, felt a strange mixture of pride and melancholy. She had brought to his home exactly what it had been lacking, not just feminine touches, but genuine human connection. She had transformed his house into a home, and in doing so, had begun to transform him as well. "You got yourself a real treasure there," James Mitchell told Victor as they stood watching the children open presents Violet had somehow managed to prepare despite the chaos of the past week. "Most ladies of means wouldn't have risked themselves in that blizzard, let alone delivered a baby in a makeshift tent." "Violet is unique," Victor agreed, his eyes following his wife as she helped Mitchell's eldest daughter try on a new wool scarf. Heard in town, she was damaged goods, a penniless widow with a failing farm. Mitchell continued, his tone conversational. "Folks wondering why a man like you would saddle himself with such a burden. But I reckon you saw what they didn't." Victor's attention snapped fully to Mitchell. "What exactly did you hear?" The farmer seemed oblivious to Victor's sudden tension. "Oh, just gossip. How she couldn't manage after her husband died. How no other man in the territory would touch her situation. How you must have had some business reason for the match." He shrugged. "But that's just talk. Anyone with eyes can see it's more than that." Victor wasn't sure whether to be angered by the town's assessment of Violet or relieved by Mitchell's assumption that their marriage was based on genuine feeling. Before he could respond, Martha Mitchell joined them, her newborn son cradled in her arms. "We've decided on a name," she announced, "if it meets with your approval." Victor raised an eyebrow, uncertain why his opinion would matter. "Victor," Martha said softly. "Victor James Mitchell. for the two men who saved his life by their actions that night. Emotion caught Victor by surprise, making it difficult to respond immediately. He had never considered that his name might continue through someone else's child, having long ago accepted that he would likely leave no direct heirs of his own. That's an honor I don't deserve, he managed finally. It was Violet who delivered him. And we'll never forget that, Martha assured him. But it was you who ordered the rescue attempt. You who risked your men and resources to save a tenant family that most landowners wouldn't think twice about in such conditions. Victor glanced across the room to where Violet now sat with the younger Mitchell children, reading them a Christmas story. As if sensing his gaze, she looked up, their eyes meeting across the crowded room. Something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of the unexpected connections that had formed through crisis and compassion. Later that night, as they prepared for bed, Victor found himself wanting to discuss what Mitchell had told him, yet uncertain how to broach the subject. Violet, arranging her hair for sleep, noticed his distraction. "Is something troubling you?" she asked, her reflection watching him in the mirror. "You've been quiet all evening." Victor hesitated, then decided on directness. "James Mitchell mentioned something today about how people in town viewed our marriage." Violet's hands stilled momentarily before she continued her routine. "I see. And what did our neighbors have to say about us?" "That you were damaged goods," his words, not mine. "That no man would have you except for business reasons." Victor watched her carefully. "Did you know that's what they thought?" A small, sad smile curved Violet's lips. "Of course I knew. Why do you think I accepted your proposal so readily? A young widow with debts and no family has few options on the frontier. Most men want either an innocent girl they can shape to their liking or a widow with property and connections." She turned to face him directly. "I had none of those advantages." The matter-of-fact way she described her situation struck Victor like a physical blow. He had considered their arrangement practical and mutually beneficial, but hearing her acknowledge the desperate nature of her position made him question whether she had ever had a real choice at all. "Is that how you see our marriage?" he asked, suddenly needing to know. "As your only option? A necessity you endure?" Something flickered in Violet's eyes, surprise, perhaps, at the intensity of his question. "I entered our arrangement with clear understanding of its terms," she said carefully. "You've been more than fair in fulfilling your obligations." "That's not what I asked," Victor pressed, moving closer to her. "I want to know how you feel about our marriage now, not the reasons you agreed to it then." Violet rose from her dressing table to stand before him, her expression guarded, yet vulnerable. "What does it matter how I feel, Victor? We made a practical arrangement that benefits us both. Feelings were never part of our negotiation." "They matter to me," he said quietly. "You matter to me. More than I anticipated. More than I planned for." Her eyes widened, hope and wariness battling in her expression. "What are you saying?" Victor took a deep breath, knowing he was about to risk the careful structure he had built around his life. "I'm saying that I married you for water rights and property boundaries, but somewhere between our wedding day and watching you deliver Martha Mitchell's baby in a blizzard, everything changed." "Victor, I love you," he said, the words feeling foreign yet essential on his tongue. "Not as an asset or a partner in a business arrangement. I love your courage and your compassion. I love how you've made this house a home. I love who I am when I'm with you." Tears filled Violet's eyes, but she made no move toward him. "You once told me love was a luxury, like fine china, unnecessary for survival." "I was wrong," Victor admitted. "These past months have taught me that some luxuries are actually necessities in disguise. You can survive without love, yes, but it's a hollow existence. I lived it for years and never knew what I was missing until you showed me." Violet studied him, as if searching for some sign that his words were another practical calculation. "Finally," she asked, "what if I can't return your feelings? What becomes of our arrangement then?" The question cut deep, but Victor forced himself to consider it honestly. "Then we continue as we have been. I won't demand what you cannot give. But I needed you to know the truth of my feelings, even if they remain unmatched." For a long moment, Violet was silent, tears still glistening in her eyes. Then, slowly, she moved toward him and placed her hand against his cheek, the same intimate gesture she had offered in Denver, but now weighted with new meaning. "When Edward died," she said softly, "I promised myself I would never again give my heart to a dreamer who built castles in the air. I would be practical, realistic. When you proposed our arrangement, it seemed perfect, a marriage based on mutual benefit rather than false promises. Victor covered her hand with his own, afraid to hope, yet unable to stop himself. And now I find myself in love with a man who built his dreams on solid ground, Violet whispered. A man who says what he means and does what he promises. A man who would risk a blizzard to save a tenant family and who looks at me as though I am more precious than all his cattle and land combined. Joy surged through Victor, so powerful it momentarily robbed him of speech. Instead, he drew Violet into his arms and kissed her, not with the restrained courtesy of their wedding day or the controlled passion of their marital duties, but with all the emotion he had been holding back for months. When they finally parted, both breathless, Violet rested her forehead against his chest. I was so afraid, she admitted. Afraid that if you knew I had developed feelings beyond our arrangement, you would think I was trying to change our terms. Victor laughed softly, cradling her face in his hands. Our terms were always insufficient, Violet. They accounted for property and respectability, but not for this. Not for the way you filled spaces in my life I didn't even know were empty. Outside their window, snow began to fall again, gentle flakes that caught the moonlight as they drifted toward Earth. But inside the room that had once been Victor's alone and was now truly theirs, warmth bloomed that had nothing to do with the fire burning in the grate and everything to do with the recognition that what had begun as a practical arrangement had transformed into something far more valuable. In the months and years that followed, the Ainsworth ranch prospered beyond even Victor's ambitious projections. The water rights that had prompted his marriage proposal proved valuable indeed, but nowhere near as precious as the partnership that had developed between husband and wife. Violet's farm, rather than being absorbed into the ranch as Victor had originally intended, became an experimental agricultural station where new crops and techniques were tested before being implemented on a larger scale. Her practical knowledge combined with Victor's business acumen created innovations that neighboring ranchers soon sought to emulate. The Mitchell family, after their cabin was rebuilt with significant improvements, became valued friends rather than mere tenants. Young Victor Mitchell grew into a sturdy boy who often visited the ranch house, especially after the birth of the Ainsworth's own children. First a daughter with her mother's honey blonde hair and her father's blue eyes, then twin boys who inherited their mother's determination and their father's head for business. As for Victor and Violet themselves, their practical arrangement evolved into a love story that became something of a legend in the territory. Occasionally, when new acquaintances learned of their unusual beginning, they would ask what had changed, how a marriage of convenience had transformed into such a visibly devoted union. Victor's answer never varied. I married for water rights and gained a woman who taught me that the truly valuable things in life cannot be counted or measured or deposited in a bank. And Violet would smile at her husband, the man who had once claimed love was a luxury and who now treated it as his most essential possession, and add, "And I'm married for security," only to discover that real wealth has nothing to do with money at all. On winter nights, with snow falling outside their window and their children asleep upstairs, they would sometimes recall that desperate rescue during the blizzard of their first December together. The night when practical considerations had fallen away in the face of life's fundamental truths, when a child had been born and something equally miraculous had awakened between them. "I never planned on loving you," Victor would confess, holding Violet close. "It was the most impractical thing I've ever done." And Violet, secure in the life they had built together, would laugh softly and reply, "Then perhaps we should be grateful that the heart recognizes necessities that the mind sometimes mistakes for luxuries." In the end, what began as a wealthy cowboy marrying a widow no one wanted had become something money could never buy, a love that had not only survived the harsh realities of the frontier, but had flourished there, proving that even in the wildest West, the most practical arrangement of all might be allowing oneself to love and be loved in return.